Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Luis Alberto Mares. I am the Director of Community Mobilization Programs at the Latino Commission on AIDS, and today I will be the moderator for this webinar. We're very happy to be back with the Pandemia series. This is our fourth installment. We started in November with the first one, but before that we had something in July. And this is a series of webinars dedicated to bring you information about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines, specifically for the Hispanic community. Pandemia is a collaboration of the Latino Commission on AIDS with the COVID-19 Prevention Network and the Hispanic Health Network. And today's webinar is going to be more like a panel discussion conversation, and it's titled COVID-19 Vaccine Rollout in the Hispanic Community. In this episode of Pandemia, we will talk about COVID-19, providing information and update on vaccine efforts and the implications the vaccine might have in medical mistrust within the Latino community and vice versa. We will engage this conversation from the perspective and expertise of physicians that work at the COVID-19 vaccine site locations in the United States, specifically in Georgia. We will break down some misconceptions of the COVID-19 vaccine and answer any questions that you may have on staying protected. We want this to be a conversation with the audience, so we encourage people to participate with questions and comments, and if you can write them on question and answer or in the chat box, our friend Jackson Terrell from the COVID-19 Prevention Network will be monitoring and handling this question, bringing to our panelists. This is also being, as you could see, streamed live on Facebook, and our friend Cynthia Hasuri from the Latino Commission will be also monitoring the questions that you will put in and write in there, and she will bring to this conversation. Today, we have our two presenters, two panelists that we know already, our dearest friends now, Dr. Paulina Rebolledo and Dr. Valeria Cantos, professors of medicine at Emory University in Atlanta. From the very beginning of the pandemic, they have been working with patients with COVID-19, and they've been participating in research as researchers in the trials of COVID-19. I want to read a brief bio from each one of them so you know better. Dr. Paulina Rebolledo was born in Mexico City, Mexico. She completed internal medicine specialty, infectious disease, and medical microbiology fellowship at Emory University, as well as master's in clinical research. She currently holds dual appointments in the Division of Infectious Disease and Department of Global Health at Emory University, and is an attending physician at Grady Memorial Hospital and the Grady Infectious Disease Clinic. Dr. Rebolledo's main research interest centers around diarrheal illness in children under 5, vaccine preventable, and ensuring the availability of infectious disease diagnostics for resource-limited populations. Since the early days of COVID-19 in Georgia, she had led testing initiatives at Grady Memorial Hospital and has been actively involved in COVID treatment-based research studies. Dr. Rebolledo has partnered with various local community organizations within the Latinx community to provide evidence-based and culturally sensitive information about COVID-19. And Dr. Valeria Cantos Lucio was born and raised in Quito, Ecuador. She completed her medical school in Ecuador, then she moved to Atlanta for her internal medicine residency at Emory University, where she acted a year as a chief resident. She completed her infectious disease fellowship at Emory. She's now an assistant professor at the Division of Infectious Disease at Emory University and an attending physician at Grady Memorial Hospital, Emory University Hospital, and the Grady Infectious Disease Clinic. Dr. Cantos' research focuses on HIV prevention in ethnic minorities with a special focus on the Latinx community. Her emphasis is on identifying and overcoming the social and structural barriers this group faces in terms of HIV testing and access to PrEP. She's interested in developing and implementing innovative and culturally responsive strategies to deliver HIV prevention services. She participates in several researches about HIV and applications for Latino men who have sex with men. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, she has been working as a lead co-investigator at Grady trials looking at the efficacy of remdesivir in the treatment of hospitalized patients with COVID-19, and she's also a co-investigator for many COVID-19 prevention network research studies, including efficacy vaccine trials and immunological studies. So as you can see, both doctors, Latinas, been participating from the very beginning in studies about vaccines, and they both have been with us before here in Pandemia. Welcome back, Paulina. Welcome back, Valeria. Thank you very much for being with us. You've been very helpful in the past, and I'm sure you're going to be very helpful today, bringing us updates and information on vaccines. So the first time we talked many months ago about vaccines, there were many vaccines in trial 5.3 happening I remember it was July when we talked the first time. So now, many months after, vaccines are out already, and people are getting vaccinated. We have Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. So publications and reports show that vaccines have different efficacy numbers, like 92%, 96%, 76% for different vaccines. So this can give people some sense that some vaccine may be better than the other vaccine, and they might start looking for where to get that vaccine specifically. So I would like you to tell us about this, what these numbers mean, and what people should do in terms of what can you tell to these people that is looking to get vaccinated with specific vaccine? Any one of you, and then the other one can.
So I can start. Thank you, Luis, for having us here today, and hello, everyone. So I'd like it's a good way to start to sort of emphasize that the best vaccine is the vaccine that's available to us. And so any of the vaccines that are currently available by emergency use authorization in the United States, they're all equally effective and protective against developing severe disease, which is what we really primarily care about. So not having to go into the hospital, not having to end up in an intensive care unit. So that's severe disease that would potentially lead to death. So all of the vaccines, the Moderna, the Pfizer, the Johnson & Johnson, all of those have shown that they prevent that severe infection. We see, different numbers being thrown out in terms of efficacy, like some are in the 90s, some are in the 60s. It's important to sort of mention that those numbers are for preventing infection, sort of like having any symptoms. But again, they were done at different times. So Moderna and Pfizer were done. We started last year in the summer, early fall, whereas Johnson & Johnson happened more in like the latter part of 2020. And there were different things going on with like COVID. So there was obviously that very pronounced wave that we saw in the winter, which is when the Johnson & Johnson was taking place, as opposed to what we saw with Moderna and Pfizer, where there was not as much, the community spread was not as severe as it was when the J&J was being carried out. And the important piece to note is that also when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trials were starting to take place, we were seeing a lot of these variants start circulating in the communities. So again, it's not fair to compare them head to head because they were happening at different times when there were changes in the severity of transmission in the community, as well as with different variants circulating as well. But important to mention that for all of them, again, they're equally effective in preventing severe disease, which is ultimately the goal of a vaccine. So I don't know if Dr. Cantos has something else to add.
Just to be clear, vaccines are not going to prevent the people to get infected with COVID-19 or with SARS-CoV-2, but are going to prevent the disease. Is that
so
right?
They will prevent infection. So, but there's we really ultimately, those numbers that we see, that efficacy, it's against protection from developing symptomatic disease, meaning that I have a cough, but it's like mild to moderate disease. So that's where that 95% for Moderna, 94% for Pfizer, and then the one in the 60s for the J&J. But all of them are 100% or above 90% protective for severe disease, which is ultimately what we care in a vaccine. Because if in the end COVID now starts to become more like a regular cold, then we've sort of met our goal.
That's interesting to know. So these vaccines will provide us with some sort of immunity against this disease, right? Do we know the length of this immunity? Do we know how long this immunity is going to last? Are we going to need a boost or a third vaccine sometime in the future, a year or 2 years? Is it going to be like the flu that we have to get vaccines every year? Do we know that? And what is being done now to know the length of this immunity, how long it's going to last?
Those are all great questions. And the short answer is we still don't know. And the reason we still don't know is because we just started administering these vaccines to large amounts of population in December. The first COVID-19 vaccine trials were started about June, July of 2020. So there's still just not enough time to accumulate enough data to know how long immunity is going to last. We do know from natural infection models, meaning from people who have had actual COVID, that the majority of people do develop protective antibodies, and that these antibodies last at least 3 months, if not more. So it's still a little bit too early to know how long immunity from vaccines will last for. In terms of booster shots, sorry, that was my kid. In terms of booster shots, what matters right now more than the duration of immunity is coverage for the variants. So Pfizer and Moderna are currently already testing new vaccine generations that will cover more variants. And that may require a third vaccination to cover for those people who have already received the quote unquote first generation vaccines. And now the other thing is that they're trying to combine it in one single shot for those who haven't received any vaccine. They can get all protection, including the variants. But the results of those studies are still to be seen.
That's very interesting. And how are we going to know? I mean, everybody who's getting vaccinated today, like let's say I get vaccinated, am I going to be part of the follow-up study to know the length of the vaccination, the immunity? Are they going to sample people who was vaccinated, or are going to just do it with the people who was part of the trials?
So initially, all the participants from the vaccine clinical trials, their overall follow-up time is 2 years. So we will know for sure and they get visits, every certain amount of months. So we will have that information. As you know, Luis, we can't really take samples from people without having them involved in a formal research project, but I am sure that there will be future epidemiological studies looking into this.
Thank you. There is some hesitancy among a lot of people in the community about the safety and the efficacy of the vaccines, because they think these vaccines were produced very fast, that they were rushed out into the use as compared to whatever time it used to take in the past to other vaccines to be produced. So can you explain why and how this process was shortened, and if these changes or modification of the timelines affected the safety specifically, because people is very worried about safety, and they think that they were not tested enough to be out, and that's why some people do not want to take the vaccines. It's more about safety.
So that's a very important point, and it's good that people ask these questions, because again, we want people to sort of understand the process and be very transparent about it. And so the way that normally clinical trials happen is that they go sequentially from phase to phase. So we start out with the pre-human studies, then we move into some which include like laboratory studies or human or animal studies, and then they move into like different phases of human studies. And so we have the phase 1, which first just takes healthy volunteers, and then phase 2, which starts to look at healthy volunteers and some laboratory measures of protection. And then we go to phase 3, which is essentially when we enroll lots of individuals across many different places. And we want to see now, how do the vaccines actually work? Do they protect people? And so that's usually from one step to the other. It can be years and years and years, because there's many different aspects, sort of like regulatory aspects and just funding issues that happen, where it takes a lot of economic investment as well as a lot of sort of like human power to be able to carry from one phase to the other. And so what happened with COVID is, because of the urgency, there was something that really has not ever happened before in a way. And that's that, the academic institutions, the pharmaceutical companies, the many different regulatory agencies, the National Institutes of Health, so government agencies, academics, and pharmaceutical companies, they all got together to try to work and invest, put a lot of economic funds into the process. So a lot of these phases could occur in parallel. So we didn't necessarily have to finish one, many years pass to move on to the other. But the important piece to mention is that all of the technology used for these vaccines that has been, you know, been in works for many, many years. So that's not something that happened in the last year. It was just that because all of that technology to create the different types of vaccines was already established, then when there was sharing of the genetic sequencing of the coronavirus, then they were able to take that information and put it into the already existing technology to be able to carry forward the trials. And then the other important piece is that all of the steps about evaluating the safety, so looking at like how it works in people, is it safe, what are the side effects, that has remained the same. So there tends to be both agencies or groups that evaluate how the vaccine is working, but then there's also independent bodies of groups of bodies of individuals that review that have nothing to do with pharmaceutical companies, nothing to do with the academic center. They're groups of like scientists that review that data to make sure that that the same rigorous process is followed as it normally has. And so while certainly the steps appeared to come at an accelerated pace, it was because of the urgency, but because we also got rid of a lot of that sort of bureaucracy and a lot of those steps in between trials, since there was so much interest, so much funding, so much brain power to try to get these vaccines to the general public.
Terrell, I think there's some questions already.
Yes, so there's a question from Ariel. Has there been an increase in interorganizational standardization and data collection surrounding COVID-19?
That's a great question. Merging data and creating homologous data sets across institutions is very complex to do. There's also the sharing of information in between organizations can get very complicated. So as far as I know, there hasn't been much in terms of trying to standardize how information about COVID is analyzed and presented to the public. So there's, as you know, there's the CDC data, there's the World Health Organization data, there is the Johns Hopkins data. And unfortunately, I don't think those have been standardized in terms of how to present it, as far as I know.
Thank you. And I think there's another one in question and answer box.
Yes, a statement was made that someone participated in the J&J COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial in December of last year. However, they did not know if they received the placebo or the actual vaccine itself. They were unblinded, but they did find out they received the actual vaccine, and they're excited about this because it was a great thing to participate in the trial, because they will be followed for 2 more years to see how their blood work will look in 2022. And then I see another comment, a question. People are asking if they were infected, how come the natural antibodies last only up to 3 months compared to other antibodies that stay in the body for other bacteria, viruses, and other antigens?
So, every virus, every bacteria is unique in its own way, and so that's why there's differences in how long the immune response or the memory cells will last for each of the different type of infectious diseases. The other important piece to know is that in addition to the antibodies, which is what we tend to think about when we talk about vaccines, there's other types of memory cells. So there's like cellular, so memory at the cellular level, which also is protective and also allows us to not necessarily get the vaccine again once we've been vaccinated. So again, it's difficult to compare one virus to the other. There's some viruses also, like, they mutate a lot quicker than others, and it has to do a lot with the community transmission. So this is not something unique to this particular virus. Coronaviruses in general, they tend to have not as a prolonged immunity. So it's just sort of like characteristics of the virus itself.
And in addition to that, maybe a clarification, maybe I didn't say this correctly, but what I meant to say is that as far as we know, these antibodies last for at least 3 months. It may be more, it's just that we don't have that data yet. So there may be, future studies once we have one more time to do the data analysis and more experience with COVID in general, to know that it actually lasts for like 6 months or 9 months or a year. And that is antibody production after natural infection, which may be different than immune protection from vaccines. So what we know is that these protective antibodies last for at least 3 months, but it may be much more than that. We just still don't have all the complete picture.
Okay. So we also know that these vaccines are used in adult population, older than 18, older than 16. Why is it that vaccines cannot be used in children? And are the vaccines not effective in the younger population? And are different vaccines being developed, or are these vaccines going to be changed to be used in children and young people?
So they currently in the United States, there's trials ongoing in the pediatric population. So as you mentioned, Luis, for Pfizer, the emergency use authorization was approved for individuals over 16, and then they completed the trials between like the 13 and the 16-year-olds. And then Moderna did a similar thing. Moderna is only licensed to be given for people older than 18. But currently they just opened the trials for pediatric populations. And the reason why these are a little bit different, and we just can't extrapolate necessarily what we see in the adults into children, is because children are not necessarily like smaller people or smaller adults. They really, they require, based on weight, they may need different amounts of like doses. And so there needs to be modification of some of these, like there needs to be dose adjustments, and sort of see again by age groups how it starts to perform. So we tend to think about sort of more the teenager group, and then more the 5 to 10-year-olds, and then under 5. So a lot of their, the same dose that is given to an adult could not be given to a child under a year. So again, a lot of these considerations need to be taken into account, and that's why the studies that are ongoing will evaluate the safety, how children respond to the vaccine based on these different doses, based on their weight. So these, we're hopeful that by the fall we'll have some results particularly for the little ones. So for those under 10 years old, that we will have some information and some of the vaccines.
So there's a lot of information like being published everywhere about coronavirus, about the vaccines, in social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter. So there is one of the things that I could find there, and I would like, we want to provide people with the right information. So I'm going to say what I get from the social media and say this yes or no and why. Okay, so the vaccines alter our genetic code or DNA. Is that
oh my
true?
goodness, this is a big no. This is a big false. This is not true. And the explanation is that yes, Pfizer and Moderna vaccine technology is mRNA technology. This is the genetic code that will produce the spike protein, and then the immune system will recognize that spike protein and will react to it. This small piece of genetic coding gets disintegrated very quickly once it gets into our body. And it never makes it into the nucleus of our cell. If you guys remember from cellular biology, every cell is made of a nucleus, and then what's around it, it's a cytoplasm. So the mRNA enters into the cytoplasm and it never makes it into the nucleus. Also, our bodies, the human bodies, do not have the capability of transforming RNA into DNA and then integrate that into our genome. That is impossible. That is something, for example, that the HIV virus can do, but not humans. So it is just not possible, biologically, physiologically, it just doesn't happen. And, one of the reasons why, for example, the Pfizer vaccine has such stringent temperature requirement for storage is because at a little bit higher temperatures, this mRNA just disintegrates. So that's why for transportation, it requires this, because it's very fragile, this genetic coding. So I hope I put a nail in the coffin on that question, because that is not true. There we go.
Yeah, I had the conversation with so many people. It's like, oh my God. So pregnant women or women who are planning to get pregnant, that's also something somebody told me, cannot receive vaccine. I don't know why they say that, but is that true or not?
So the reason why why people may think about that is because the vaccines were not necessarily tested. The target population was not pregnant women, but there were women during both in the Moderna and the Pfizer study that became pregnant, and they were followed throughout the where we are so far with the study. And so we have also seen from from this past year, both from the clinical side as well as just the epidemiologic data, that pregnant women as a group have a higher risk of having severe COVID. And so that's why it's recommended that even though the studies per se were not they were not tested initially on pregnant population, because of what we saw, that there were people who became pregnant and they did fine. There's a recommendation to vaccinate pregnant women as well as those who are breastfeeding, to try again to diminish their risk of developing severe COVID. There is no reason, again, based on the technology, that these vaccines would not be safe. And now, to take it a step further, they're currently doing studies in pregnant population to sort of see how the vaccine overall, how their body or their immune response occurs, and just, again, the overall like safety. So the more safety information we have, the better off we are.
So it's not only not true, but women should get vaccinated.
Yeah, it's a it's a discussion that they should have with their OBGYN, but strongly everything points that they should receive the vaccine, again, because of the high risk that if they receive COVID, what that would mean for them as well as for the baby.
Great. So if I get vaccinated with a vaccine for COVID-19, I can get COVID-19. True or not?
That is a great question. So as you know, the efficacy for each of the vaccine candidates varies from the 70s to the 90s. So there's still that small percentage of people who could potentially still develop COVID despite the vaccine. That said, the way that we talk with vaccines, I would love to receive a vaccine that is not 100% effective, but that is 90% effective, instead of getting no vaccine and getting 0% protection. The likelihood of, and again, the main take-home point is that these vaccines prevent severe COVID in 100% or close to 100% of people. So even if a person falls into that small percentage that they still develop COVID after receiving the vaccine, it is likely that they will have something like a cold or not even have symptoms. And it is a protection, it's a guarantee that they will not end up in the hospital or connected to a machine or, God forbid, dead from COVID. That is the important part of the vaccine. That is why we care. Like Paulina said a minute ago, if COVID was only another cold, who cares, right? Why would we even be talking about it a year later? So that's our goal.
Great. If I already have COVID-19, I don't need to get vaccinated. True or not?
So that's a very good question, and you do need to get vaccinated, and we'll kind of like break it down into two pieces. And the first one being when you get natural COVID infection, so you get COVID-19, the immune response of your body is in a way like very disorganized. So it's not necessarily, it's sort of like, very busy trying to do its thing. So it's not something that is like succinct and it's like targeted. It's just a very overall general disorganized response. Whereas the vaccine, it makes those memory cells be more specific to certain parts of the coronavirus. So it becomes more of an intelligent, a more targeted memory that will remain after the vaccine, as opposed to having been infected with COVID-19. Now, having said that, it does appear to be from some of the available data that if you have had COVID-19, it may be that you only really need one more dose, or one dose of the COVID vaccine. And the reason for that being that, again, when you initially had that infection, you had that disorganized cell, then that sort of served as the first taste to your body of what the COVID was. And then when you get the first shot of the vaccine, then it reminds your body of what that is, and it produces a strong immune response. So we're not there yet. So we're not recommending like, oh, if you had COVID-19, you will only need a dose. But that may be I mentioned that because some of the data that's emerging may point that some individuals may only need one dose.
Yeah, information keeps on changing every day. Like it's a very new disease. We only have a year with this, and we already learned so much in a year, which is so different to what it used to be in the past. So one more before we go to the audience questions in this thing that I got from social media is, once I get vaccinated, I can stop wearing masks. I can stop keeping my distance from people. I can go back to my normal life. Is that true or not?
I'm so glad I got this question because it's one of my favorite questions. So if you guys saw, there was a recent CDC recommendation coming out about the use of masking among people who are vaccinated in non-healthcare settings. So this is the first time that the confidence that we have on the effectiveness of these vaccines have led to the CDC to say, if there are two households that are fully vaccinated and they're planning to get together, and there are no people who are vulnerable, if everyone is vaccinated, they can get together without masks. And I think this is something that it's very important, because we need some hope at this point. Like after a year of COVID, we need to have some hope that all of the efforts that we've been doing for a while, and now the efforts on getting vaccinated, will allow us to, if we're vaccinated, to go visit our vaccinated grandma and give her a hug and give her a kiss and not have to worry about the mask. So that is the first recommendation. That said, there's always a caveat with everything, right? So that said, because we haven't achieved the population percent of vaccination that we're targeting, which is close to 80%, when we are in public settings, we don't know which individual has been vaccinated and who hasn't. This is why the recommendation of masking and distancing stands when we're in public settings, because it makes sense, right? So if we are vaccinated, but we are unmasked, even if there's a tiny little bit percentage that we may be shedding viruses without knowing, may exist. And we don't know also the other people. If someone is not vaccinated and we are the unlucky person who falls into the 5% who can develop COVID after being vaccinated, it's just unnecessary risk. So basically summarizing, if you live in a household where everyone has been vaccinated, you have another household when everyone has been vaccinated, you can get together without masks. Otherwise, keep using the mask, keep distancing, until we reach that critical point of what we call herd immunity, about 80%. And then I am sure that the CDC will provide more guidance at that point in terms of masking, distancing, and also depending on how the local epidemic is going in the United States.
Thank you. So Terrell, I think there are more questions from the audience. Can you?
Yes, we have quite a few. One question we have here is, we know that there is mistrust in communities of color in reference to the government and the medical system. Do you feel that there is more of an issue of hesitancy or access in reference to Latinx communities and the vaccine?
So that's a really good question and point. And I think I from what we've seen from working with the community, I think first and foremost, it comes down to an issue about accessibility. And so it's very challenging for, as you probably all have heard, for a lot of monolingual, so only Spanish speaking individuals, and even bilingual individuals to be able to register. A lot of the sites from the health departments are not necessarily in Spanish. They require, being relatively savvy with the different browsers. And so I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what the criteria are, because it's not very visible and sort of like standardized across even within the same state, and let alone within the United States. So I think it does come down to a problem of accessibility. And then the other important piece that is relevant to our community is the status of people have fear that they will be asked about documentation, that if they're uninsured, that they will be asked. And a lot of the registration sites say, do you have insurance? And even though there's a box there that says, no, I do not have insurance, and we have not done such a good job at making it very clear that you receiving the vaccine is not conditional on being undocumented or on not having insurance. And so I think for all of those reasons, people are, it's just challenging to be able to access the vaccine. There may be a component of hesitancy or questioning the vaccine. I don't necessarily know if there's sort of almost like two different buckets, people who just have questions around the vaccine, and then maybe the other ones who are truly hesitant. But I think until we really tackle the problem of accessibility, it's not fair to blame it and just say people just don't want to get it because they're hesitant, because I feel like we have not been able to really dissect the problem of vaccine accessibility.
Okay, and it looks like we have a good follow-up question for that. Someone asked, what actions can we take to increase vaccine confidence, especially at a time when the Latino community has been hard hit by COVID-19?
So I think to sort of finish on that piece is some of the things that I was mentioning. So one, have materials available in Spanish, and have them be not only in Spanish, but really be culturally sensitive and that resonate with the community, and use a lot of the sort of the help of community-based organizations to try to work with the health departments and identify things that are those sort of barriers, the need for pre-registration, or that vaccines maybe are only happening at a center that's really requires transportation to be able to get there. So try to sort of create more pop-up sites and bring vaccines to the community. So some of the things that we have been doing here in Georgia, and I know are occurring across the country, are trying to partner with community organizations and going to spaces where the community trusts and that they're used to going, and that they can identify those partners, and that they feel safe and they feel protected in those sort of venues around vaccination. But I think one of the key things is that we have to sort of hold leaders accountable, and health departments is about making the registration process as easy as possible, and also holding the retail pharmacies, a lot of the commercials, the Walgreens, the Publix, and all of those that are offering the vaccines, just making it sort of putting out statements that really there's no need for insurance. This is something that is being offered for pretty much anybody who wants it.
Okay. We have some more questions surrounding effectiveness and severity of the vaccines. One question is, when we consider effectiveness of the vaccine, is it known if there's a difference in individuals who are detectable versus undetectable for the vaccines?
I don't really understand what detectable for the vaccine is. Maybe they can clarify it. And in the meantime, we can keep going, because I don't really know.
Yeah.
Do you know what they mean, Pao?
No, I don't know if they mean maybe asymptomatic, so not having symptoms, and but I don't know. Maybe
Okay.
I could.
Okay, we can continue. All right, so another question is, they have reported some issues with AstraZeneca, which still has not been approved by the FDA, but the administration is thinking of sharing the doses received with Mexico and Canada. What are your thoughts on this, and have you seen any data about its safety?
We have. So the as far as we know, the data that has been presented by AstraZeneca, not only in the US data, but also internationally, it is a very good vaccine. It has some differences in efficacy for the variants, especially the South African variant, where it seems it doesn't really help at all. But overall, it's a good vaccine and it's a safe vaccine. The problem specifically with AstraZeneca is that they could have done much better in how they communicate the results to the public. So the recent, hiccup in terms of communication with AstraZeneca was that they presented data that was not all the way updated with the latest data that they had. So the DSMB, or the Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is an independent board from the pharmaceutical company, in addition to the NIH, they replied to the press release and said, we are concerned that you're not coming out with the most updated information. Please do so. So they did. They came out with newer information. They did more data analysis. I think the communication piece of it has done a complete disservice to a very good vaccine, and to a vaccine that is accessible to other countries. Hopefully they will change course. And I really I know that it sounds bad saying the vaccine is not approved for the FDA, so it's not good enough for the United States, yet you're sending it to other countries. But I think it's more of the planning ahead, because overall it looks like it is a very good vaccine and it is very safe. And as you know, vaccine access equity in the whole world is terrible. The United States had bought 3 times the amount of vaccines that is needed to vaccinate the entire population. So we're going to be done vaccinating our whole population, and we'll have surplus. And it's only fair that that surplus is donated to other countries that may not have access, including the AstraZeneca vaccine, but not only that one, but also Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson, and all the other ones.
Okay. Another question asks, well, they state first that there are reports of severe adverse events after vaccination for the 3 current US vaccines. Can you provide any commentary on that?
So, when it's important when we talk about, I guess, adverse events to the vaccines, that we make a differentiation between like side effects and then adverse events. And so side effects are, to a certain extent, signs and symptoms that one will experience from getting the vaccine and from the body starting to work on producing those memory cells. So that includes usually the pain at the injection site, some redness, whether you may have fever, headache, body aches. So a lot of that is essentially your body doing its job to try to create those memory cells, so that when you encounter, or if you encounter the real virus, then it will know what to do. That's sort of like the side effects that, and again, they may not be comfortable, but in a sense, they're to a large extent, they're expected. And then we have adverse events, and adverse events can be related to the vaccine and they may not be related to the vaccine. Some of the ones that we've seen, particularly in the sort of like in the US with, and that's, I don't know if that's what you were mentioning, are the cases of anaphylaxis. So those very exaggerated responses to the very pronounced allergic reaction. And I will say that those events are very, very rare. They're still, even though they're very severe, also all of the reports that have occurred, people have recovered, and they've recovered either in the, they've needed the emergency room or being hospitalized for a short period of time. But everybody pretty much that has had one of those severe anaphylactic reactions, so very severe allergic reactions, has made a full recovery. The other important point, the other important type of event are those severe adverse events that, again, maybe or maybe not related to the vaccine, and sort of like what we have been seeing with the AstraZeneca and other places, where the question about like having like clots may be related to the vaccine. The other thing that we need to think about is that when we're vaccinating a very large population, and particularly when we're vaccinating individuals who are higher risk, so meaning like older individuals who tend to have more diabetes or more hypertension or heart problems, we are going to see these severe events happen. So we are going to see heart attacks. We are going to see strokes. We are going to see, some of these like cancer. And it doesn't mean that it's related to the vaccine. It probably would have happened regardless of the vaccine, but it just seemed to happen at the, sort of like in the time frame of when one received the vaccine. So this other very important agency that is both in the United States as well as abroad are the ones that look at what happens after people start getting the vaccine. And those are the ones that start looking at the surveillance to make sure, and they analyze. So it's important that if we see these things, that they're scrutinized and they're like looked at to make sure that there is no relationship. But it is normal, and we will see that as more and more people get vaccinated, we will see some of these adverse events that, again, they may have nothing to do with the vaccine. They're part of like normal process of life, as sad as they may be. But again, that they're not, so we should not automatically assume if somebody had a heart attack and they had the vaccine 2 weeks before, it means that it's the vaccine. Think about, it's important to think about the context of the population that is receiving the vaccine, and that they may just be in general as part of like the normal process of aging at higher risk for some of these events. So hopefully I answered your question, but if not, please, put a follow-up in the box.
Yes, I want to have one question here. From the beginning of the pandemic, it was noticed that communities most affected by it were minorities, specifically Hispanic, Latinos, and Black communities. Now that the vaccines are out, the latest report on CDC on race and ethnicity of the people receiving the vaccine shows that among those people who gave information about the race and ethnicity, only 9% are Latinos and 8% are Blacks. Most of the people receiving vaccines are the white community, belong to the white community. So what do you think this is happening? What do you think is preventing Latinos and Blacks from getting vaccinated? What factors can be contributing to this disparity? And what we can do about it?
I think some of them Paulina already touched on. So as I think we've been saying this since COVID started, so the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the pre-existing inequities in terms of healthcare access to Black and Latino populations. So that happened with the testing, that happened to access to therapeutics, that happened with access to clinical trials for COVID. And then now it's not surprising that is happening with vaccines. So in these communities who have limited access to healthcare to begin with, who have limited rate of insurance, so they may not know the way to access vaccines. So Paulina was talking about that it's more about like the social and structural factors that we need to change behind vaccine access more than the population themselves. So there, like Paulina was saying, there will be hesitancy, and there will be questions, and there will be myths, and there will be misinformation, but that is not an excuse for organizations and for healthcare systems not to do their best to optimize vaccine access, at the same time addressing all these other issues. So if you know that your family members, your neighbors got the vaccine and that now they're actually doing okay, then you may be more likely to get the vaccine yourselves. But if you know that every time that all the people around you who have tried to get the vaccine have been unsuccessful, then you're not even going to try. So some of the things that we could do is the things that Paulina already mentioned. And I'm going to talk about the Latino community in particular, because that's the one that we've been working the most, but some of these also apply to the Black community. So making sure that the language is accessible, not only that it's in Spanish, but that it's in Spanish that is understandable. Making sure that the virtual or online website literacy doesn't represent a barrier. And then most of what I've heard, like the answers like, oh, we also have a hotline. Yeah, so what? But the hotline's still in and you're still on hold for like 3 hours before you give up. So there needs to be innovative ways to overcome these barriers. And yes, they may be more costly and they may take time, but it is worth it. It is time and money well invested, but because these are human lives that we're talking about. So, you know, mobile units that go to the neighborhoods where people live, in-home administration of vaccines for elderly people who may not have, you know, transportation or the adequate mobility to go to these places. Patient navigators to assist with registration process and with scheduling second doses. In addition to the overall, you know, public education and things of that sort. So those are very few examples. And I think Paulina and I feel very strongly about this because this is what we've been doing for a long time. So I don't want to, you know, keep talking about it for hours, but there's a lot of work to do in that relaying on local community-based organizations cannot be emphasized enough.
Thank you. One more, by the way, I noticed that there's a lot of questions in the chat box. I saved the chat box, so I will forward the questions that haven't been answered to Paulina and Valeria, and I will send probably to everybody who attended here today. So the first time we had a chance to talk about COVID-19, as I mentioned before, it was July last year when the phase 3 studies were rolling out for the first time. So I remember you presented a chart with 7 or 8 vaccines, and so far only 3 having approved and are being used. So what happened with all those 5 more vaccines that were in the process? Are they still going to come out? If now that we have vaccines actually given to the people, we need people to be enrolled in those studies. How is it going to happen?
So some of those, there are still studies that are ongoing from that list. So like, for example, the Novavax, that one we completed enrollment. Emory is one of the sites. And so now we're sort of like looking at different aspects and and addressing that exact question about like, if people got the actual vaccine versus the placebo, like what's going to happen with those participants. So that sort of like study is still ongoing. Some of the other ones, for example, the Sanofi, they completed their first phases. So the ones that look at safety and just looked at the laboratory immune response. And they are thinking about whether they would do a study. The problem that we start to encounter with a lot of these vaccines is if we have some of these other emergency use authorized vaccines, like how, the challenges about the ethical aspects around continuing to carry out those studies. And so there's creative ways that you can do that where you sort of, again, a lot of them may be offering what we call crossover. So like people still may get, which is something that may happen with Novavax, is that they get the actual vaccine, some get placebo as normally would happen, and then you cross everybody over. So then the ones that got vaccine now get placebo, and the ones that got placebo get vaccine. And so that way you can still look at, it won't be perfect, it won't be the same way, but there's ways around sort of like some of those challenges. It is important to realize that there's still a lot to be done in the vaccine trial, I guess, arena for COVID. And the reason is that we're probably, as we talked about the vaccine equity piece, we will probably need more and more candidates. And now we had, as Valeria mentioned, we had the first generations. We'll probably need the second generations, which incorporate some of the variants. And then another aspect, we'll be looking at what happens if you get combination of the vaccine. So what happens if you got one, let's say you got one similar to Moderna with that technology, so an mRNA, and then you got a Johnson & Johnson, which is more based on an adenovirus, so a different sort of like technology. And so some of those combinations, so mix and match strategies, so a lot of these questions are still important to be answered from an equity perspective. And again, because we don't necessarily know how long the immunity may last, and we may need to look at some of these like different strategies to really be able to control the pandemic. And then the last piece about sort of what you were mentioning, Luis, is like, it's normal that for a lot of the vaccines that start out really only in normal non-COVID time. So when a vaccine is sort of like first thought about, or the process is thought about, really only like less than 10% actually make it to the licensure process. So in a sense, this has even been a little bit better from the time. But there's a lot of like data. The New York Times has this great infographic about the coronavirus, the vaccine tracker, which sort of shows in what different stages things are. But it's part of the normal process. If some of them are not working, then they get abandoned, and you move on or try to do different strategies.
The good news is that eventually we might have more vaccines that are going to be useful for this condition. That's great. So we have a couple more minutes. Maybe Terrell can give us one more question from the audience and before we close.
Sure. So I asked a question earlier surrounding effectiveness of the vaccine for those who are detectable or undetectable. Someone provided some additional context that this might be related to those living with HIV, and if those individuals were actually included in the vaccine clinical trials.
Got it. Okay. So there were patients who living with HIV that were included in the vaccine trials. Specifically, when we enrolled for Moderna, there were a few participants who had been living with HIV. The only criteria was that your virus had to be undetectable and your CD4 count above 200 on stable antiretroviral therapy. But the percentage of participation of people living with HIV is too small to make definitive conclusions in terms of immune response. That said, extrapolating from other vaccine studies, the only potential concern would be that people who are not virally suppressed or who have a lower CD4 count may not have the full efficacy numbers than people who have a normal immune system. But in terms of safety, there aren't any concerns, which is why both Paulina and myself are HIV physicians. We take care of people living with HIV. We are recommending all of our patients now are eligible to get the vaccine. And actually this Saturday, we'll be doing a big vaccine blitz for all of our patients and giving it to them.
Thank you. So it's 2 o'clock already and we are running out of time. I want to thank Paulina and Valeria for being with us again. As always, great presentation, great answers. Thank you so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure. And thank you for the work you do. So everybody, thank you very much for being in the webinar with us. I hope to have you again next month when we have Pandemia number 5. We will send you the information. Thank you, Terrell. Thank you, Sina. And again, thank you, Paulina and Valeria.
Thank you. This was great.